pleasure to be here. I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the traditional territories of the Snuneymuxw people before we start, and that we've had wonderful partnership with the Snuneymuxw for well over 76, 77 years as we've delivered education in this region. Before our presenter comes in this morning, I'd just like to acknowledge the faculty and staff and Arts and Humanities who have worked so hard to create this series for us. It's through the efforts of that dedicated faculty and staff who recognized that there was a real need in our community to provide an opportunity for us to get into dialogue on topics that are of interest within our community and indeed the broader community around us. And the growth of the audience that we've seen over that 5 years is certainly an indicator of the importance of these dialogues. So we're very, very pleased that we've seen that growth, and again, I want to thank the faculty and the staff in Arts and Humanities for the work that they've done to achieve that. You know, we're a community of shared interest here at the university, and certainly this university has grown out of the community over the 76 years we've been here. And this university wants to and does remain relevant, responsive, and innovative in making sure that we're involved in the dialogues in the community of importance. This is another demonstration of that relevance and responsiveness to the community need for dialogue. And it's coming from our Arts and Humanities faculty who recognize the importance of getting topics in front of the community where we have to think. And we have to think, and we have to discuss, and we get together on these topics. So while we're in here listening to these topics today and listening to the speakers and the stimulation from the individuals that are here, we'll go away from these discussions by ourselves through the rest of the day, through the next month, before the next colloquium series, and indeed beyond, where we're thinking about the things that have been provided for us today in the conversation. Very important for all of us to continue to think, provide that critical space for us to get into dialogues with each other, and to think about some really critical issues that are important for us. One of the things that we're developing also, as this dialogues go on, is we're developing a whole set of friends of the Arts and Humanities faculty. Because as we have more dialogues, as people see the importance of this, and as people appreciate the conversations, there's a recognition and a thirst for these different types of dialogues, these different types of topics, and the ability to engage in the kind of discussions. And to see people and recognize them here in the theater, but also outside, whether in coffee shops, whether in various places in our communities, whether it's on campus, or whether it's in the broader community. And to be able to engage and think about some of the topics. The fall series that the Arts and Humanities colloquium put forward is about the 100th anniversary of the First World War. And what we're finding in this fall series is that the topics have been related to the themes of the war and its consequences. There's many, many years that have passed since the Great War, but scholars in Arts and Humanities continue to examine events of such importance and to create a deeper understanding and appreciation of their significance. And we've seen that with the first talk that we had in this fall series, when we had the opportunity to listen and understand more about an individual poet from that First World War. That was Kathy Page's presentation. Today we get to hear about drones and the drone technology in the military. Something that many of us hadn't thought about. We thought about it very recently because we hear a lot more about it. We had a great front page article that Julie put in the front page of our local paper. But how many of us knew that drones were being used way back when, at the First World War? But I think it's important also how we take these discussions as audience members and consumers of the rich scholarship in Arts and Humanities. A modern university responsibility is a place that opens up dialogue and discussion, a place where you create a space for that dialogue to happen. And as a modern university, as Vancouver Island University continues to evolve, it takes very, very seriously that responsibility as a tax-supported institution to make sure that those dialogues are happening in the communities that we serve. And this is an excellent example of how our faculty and staff have taken that lead. This morning, I think we're both going to be intrigued and inspired by a presentation on drones used in the military surveillance by two academics who have deep experience researching and writing about the subject. As they will be formally introduced in a moment, I'll leave that off once more with a thank you to all of you for being here today, to take the time to join the colloquium series, and the faculty who dedicate so many hours to making sure that we have this space, that we have this opportunity in our community and ensure that we have the series that we have this fall and indeed for the last 5 years. Once again, it's an opportunity to showcase the incredible variety of skill sets that we have in our Faculty of Arts and Humanities. It highlights the research that's going on at this university, your university, and indeed the incredible opportunities and the contributions to scholarships that these disciplines make to the lives of Canadians, now, in the past, now, and indeed into the future. And now I'd like to introduce John Hine, who will introduce you to our speaker today. Thank you very much.
First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Nilsson for his kind words and for his continued support of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities and the Arts and Humanities Colloquium Series. Good morning, everyone. My name is John Hine, and I teach in the Department of History at VIU. And it is absolutely wonderful to see so many people here today at the colloquium. The rise of drones from the Great War to Gaza. This is really a full house. I think it's a tribute to the importance of this topic. On the 19th of October, 1914, almost exactly 100 years ago today, the First Battle of Ypres began. This was a decisive battle in the First World War. It marked the end of the so-called race to the sea, in which both the Germans and the Western Allies had tried to turn the other's flank, and the beginning of the static trench warfare that would last until mobility was finally restored with the spring and summer offensives of 1918. It is also famous for the legendary Kindermord, or massacre of the innocents, because of the high percentage of student volunteers killed on the German side, and more significantly perhaps, because serving in the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment was none other than Adolf Hitler. He survived, but probably 20,000 or more of his comrades did not. The First World War ushered in what the late historian Eric Hobsbawm called the Age of Extremes, but which might also be called the Age of Atrocity. Never before had industry and technology been harnessed together with such destructive effect. Advances in technology made possible novel uses of military force and killing on a truly industrial scale. It would not be unreasonable to suggest that the widespread use of machine guns, submarines, tanks, and airplanes not only transformed the nature of combat, but also the character of the war itself. Total war, it would seem, had arrived. How technology impacts its use and changes the political, cultural, and ethical nature of warfare is the subject of Anne Rogers and John Hill's recent book, Unmanned, Drone Warfare and Global Security. A remarkable and quite frightening analysis of the history and use of drones or unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, which, as we will hear today, have some important roots in the First World War. Over the course of the last decades, drones have been introduced on a vast scale into the armories of the world's major military powers. Used in both surveillance and combat roles, they have become an attractive option for military forces around the globe because of their unparalleled access. They can go where no other weapon system can. Their unprecedented persistence. They can monitor and hover over targets for days on end. And their potential accuracy due to their high-tech targeting systems, all the while removing pilots from the combat zone. At the risk of me giving away the plot, Anne and John show that in just a very short period of time, drones have had a huge, perhaps revolutionary impact on how war is waged. Apart from the specter of a sci-fi future of autonomous killer robots run amok, or dark clouds of swarming drones honing in on unsuspecting targets, I find that the scariest thing. I imagine, insect-sized drones, swarms, millions of them, just zooming in. And what can you do? Reach with a little, I don't know, little bomb attached to it. Apart from that, drones represent a new type of warfare, what Anne and John refer to as nano-war, or the ability of states to bring military-scale force to bear on specific individuals in situations where the delivery of such force would otherwise have been difficult or unacceptable. The implications of this are far-reaching, legally, politically, militarily, and ethically, as drones redefine conflict, change how wars are fought, and create new applications for military force. Just as ominously, however, drones also have implications for how global relations are conducted. On the one hand, they enable today's powers to intervene overseas with impunity at little cost to themselves, thereby raising the possibility of total control and total victory. On the other hand, by lowering the threshold for the application of military-scale violence and thereby destabilizing global relations further, it seems that over the course of the last 100 years, we've gone from the reality of total war to the nightmare of perpetual war. I'd like, however, to conclude on a much happier note. Anne and John's work on such an important and timely topic has, well, I think as we can see from the crowd today, it's started to cause a stir. It's gained local, national, and international attention. So far, there have been interviews and stories and newspapers and journals as diverse as, for instance, the Ladysmith Chronicle, which we know is a prestigious paper, the Nanaimo Daily News, the Ottawa Citizen, the New Statesman, as well as in media giants such as the BBC and CTV. Okay, perhaps CTV is not quite in the same league as BBC, but nonetheless. So we are indeed fortunate to have Anne and John here at DIU today, and it is with great pleasure indeed, that I welcome them to the stage.
Well, it's really dark back there. I can't see anything. But thank you, that was a lovely welcome. And thanks to everybody for coming out today. So I'm going to just jump right in here once I get my technology sorted out, because this is all about technology. And today we're exploring what difference drones make when it comes to waging war. You hear a lot about civilian uses, that's becoming a bit of a problem, but we're looking at the uses for warfare. And we are going to be talking a lot about technology, but I really just want to stress at the outset that it's not really just about the technology. It's about us. It's about our relationship to that technology. As the Canadian media theorist Marshall McLuhan suggests, we shape our tools and then our tools start to shape us. In other words, we invent and adopt technologies to help make our lives better, and then find that somehow along the way the world has changed as a result of the choices we make. And often the world changes in ways we didn't necessarily anticipate or expect or even want. And here, cars are a good example of this. The horseless carriage was invented to take us from point A to point B without the hassle of having to keep a horse. Good idea, right? Possibly nobody ever really thought through the consequences of that. But our society adopted the automobile, and then we began to change our environment to accommodate it. And we ended up, not just with cars and with highways and suburbs and shopping malls, but we also found that our cities and towns began to change shape. There were also more silent influences. We began to lose contact with our neighbors because we just got straight into our cars and drove to where we were going. We stopped going to the corner store. Our health began to decline. We began to contribute to things like climate change. So technology can produce really profound changes in a society. McLuhan told us we can get ahead of the curve. We really just have to stop and think about what we're doing and try to anticipate possible consequences of adopting these new technologies, or at least recognize the directions that they might head us towards so we can plan for them. And he said control over change would seem to consist in moving not with it, but ahead of it. And so that's what John and I have been trying to do in terms of looking at drones. We've been investigating what changes the military's adoption of unmanned aerial systems might lead to. Like taking the horse out of the carriage, what might happen if we take the person out of the aircraft? And for us, this has been a two-part process. On the one hand, we're trying to figure out how drones are actually being used by states and governments and by militaries, partly because they're trying to figure it out themselves. They still don't know the potential they have there. And also they're quite secretive about what they're getting up to. So there's a lot of information gaps we found. And on the other hand, we're also working at that McLuhanite level. We're wondering whether drones are a disruptive technology that is introducing large-scale and even global changes to our security, to how wars are fought. And so to try and get at that question, we've been looking at the effects of their use. So I'm going to start off today with kind of a drones 101, just to get us up to speed on what they are, and more importantly, what makes them different from manned systems, just to kind of get us all into that zone. And then I'm going to suggest some ways in which our relationship to these particular machines might be different than what we're used to. So we'll start off, this is a basic kit. This is a Predator, unmanned aerial system. You're probably familiar with it. And so the UAV, the drone itself, that is the unmanned aerial vehicle. That's the part that's flying around, usually in Afghanistan or Iraq. It's controlled remotely via satellite link from a ground station. And in the Predator's case, the ground station is usually located with its crew about 11,000 kilometers away in the US. Quite near Las Vegas, as a matter of fact. This slide gives you a little bit more detail on what the UAV is carrying. You see there's various cameras and sensors, as well as weapons. Now the Predator also has a pretty good autopilot system, and so the crew at the ground station is sitting there sort of controlling it, looking at the sensors, looking at the feed that's coming back from via satellite links. And there's about a 2-second delay. The main mission for drones is, of course, surveillance, or ISR as they call it in the military, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. And that gives you a nice, that was from the Daily Express a couple of weeks ago. They thought they spotted Jihadi John with their drone, and it also makes a mention there that they could see the hostages with their orange jumpsuits on. So that's the kind of surveillance they can perform. So mainly surveillance, but also they acquire targets. They're looking for threats, and I'll be talking about that. And then, of course, sometimes they attack, and that's the famous drone strike. So that's the part that's out in the field. And then, of course, we're back here with our ground crew. They sit in these lazy, comfy boy chairs, and they're mockingly called the chair force, and they don't get a lot of respect in the Air Force. So that gives you the basic parameters, and let's just think about our relationship with that technology. Now, you right now have two things in common with the chair force. First thing is you are sitting comfortably, I hope. You're a long way from any danger, I hope. You can get up and go, you can leave your seat, you can take a break, somebody else can take your place, you're safe, and you can be easily replaced. So that's one thing. Second thing you're doing that is like a drone pilot is you're looking at a screen. So you're here physically, but mentally you're engaged somewhere else. You're looking at what's on the screen. So that's kind of the difference. And so there's a few advantages there that kind of configuration gives us. And John alluded to this earlier. I'll just go over it again. The main thing they do is they provide access. Because you are sitting safely, you can go off, you can send your drone off wherever you like, wherever you need it to go, without any risk. You know, at worst you're going to lose the airframe, and maybe some government is going to be angry with you. But you yourself are 100% safe from the enemy. The second thing they do is they provide a persistent presence. When crews get tired, they can take a break, you can bring in a new crew. And so you can have your drone up there all the time. And the very best manned platforms really push it to stay there on task for about 12 hours. And towards the end of a mission, obviously the crew starts to get very tired and their performance degrades. So being able to refresh your crew this way is really important, which is really good efficacy. You put all that together and you get this potential for amazing accuracy. Because they can go where we want them to go, they can stay there for extended periods, they provide better situational awareness. And so, we hope better targeting. And so even if they're using the same weapons systems as a manned aircraft would, you can sort of sit back and wait until you get a really good shot. And drone operators talk about putting the warhead on the forehead. They just wait and wait and wait, and then when the moment comes, they can take it. They don't have to rush. So that's kind of the obvious stuff about drones, how they work and what advantages they confer. So that's how we use our tools. But now I want to talk a little bit about how we can step into a more of a clue and night analysis and ask how these tools then somehow begin to shape us. You're controlling the drone, you think, but how is that drone shaping what you're doing with it? And this brings us into what we call the politics of vision. And there's a couple of ways I'm going to talk about to suggest how the drone might be shaping what it is you're doing. First off, there's the way it actually constructs your view, what you're looking down at. And you're looking down over an area, and we call this an aerial gaze. And this is a godlike view. This is a universal view. And of course, we tend to associate it as being a military view. It's associated with air power. I've got a quote here from a drone predator pilot, Matt Matthews, who said, "Each day I looked through my camera, I snooped around, and I felt like a god." He felt, that power. And there's a little quote there down the side by Karen Kaplan, who works on air power. And she called it a cosmic view that promises to link subjects in a unified gaze for the purpose of viewing and mastering a world that had been unknown or unobserved. So that gives you that sense of penetration and access into areas that we couldn't get to before. So the drone places the operator in a position of relative power over someone else. Some research suggests that this dehumanizes the people below us. And in fact, we feel superior to them because we feel we have this godlike power. And in fact, drone operators have a slang for the dead bodies that appear on their screens. They call them bug splat because they appear as green on their sensors. So this is I ran across this yesterday. This is an interesting piece of civil resistance from a Pakistan village, where to try to rehumanize themselves in the gaze of the drone operators, they did this art installation where they actually unrolled this giant picture of a child to say, hey, we aren't bug splat, we are people down here, we are children down here. But sort of an interesting way to try to talk to that operator 11,000 kilometers away. And this, of course, brings us to the purpose of the drone. And the reason the drone is there in the first place is that the crew is looking for trouble. You're assuming that there's something down there that you have a problem with, and you might need to target it. So the crew's assuming that there are enemies down there rather than children. And that's going to shape its view and how it sees things. And it perceives what it's looking at. We start to perceive it as a place of violence, a place of danger. We surveil it, and in this way we call targets into being. We're actually looking at an area and just seeing it as targets or not targets. And so with the drone, we stop seeing people as people. We just start seeing them as military objects. Drones are mainly used for surveillance missions, and that sounds fairly benign. But really it isn't, because surveillance is what makes it possible to go from a view to a kill. That's what's giving you that ability. And we're very powerfully programmed. And you know which one to shoot, right, when I show you, right? I mean, these assumptions are triggered by the way things are framed for our view. So you can begin to see the way that our tools are shaping the way, the way we perceive and interact with the environment. Now, the final piece to this is that this is a computer-mediated battle. The drone crew's interactions with its objects are conducted through that technology, through that link. And we don't really know a lot about what that means. We don't know how the medium is shaping that drone operator's experience. You know, are they emotionally detached from what they're seeing? Is it like a video game to them? Or are they in fact really emotionally engaged? After all, you know, often there's these people they know down there that are caught in firefights that they're watching and they can't actually go to help. So that's an issue. Personality types matter a lot. The people who are good at doing the general surveillance task, which is famously boring, because you're just flying around for your 12-hour shift, you know, looking for something to happen, really dull. The people that are good at that, sort of good at those kinds of tasks, are not as good when something happens and they have to react and start making decisions. On the other hand, they've tried seeing if people that are good at gaming are good drone operators. And they're not, because they're used to a lot of stimulation. And so those boring tasks, that sends them to sleep, so that they don't make good drone operators either. And so the research into whether drone operators make different decisions or react differently because of this configuration is inconclusive, and it points in all sorts of different directions. And you can kind of parallel this with research into television violence, which has been going on for decades now. And still, nobody's been able to kind of get into those direct links between whether aggressive people like watching violence on TV, or whether watching violence on TV sort of predisposes people to becoming more aggressive. There are just so many variables. You know, the research can't actually make those links, and I think we'll find the same thing when we start looking at the psychology of warfighting by a remote. So we don't really understand the dynamics of these issues. We do know that drone operators suffer stress, burnout, PTSD, but that might be to do with other issues entirely. After all, they do work long hours, it is boring, their morale is low, they're laughed at as being the chair force. It's seen as a career dead end at the moment. So there's a lot of variables in play. So that kind of gives you a bit of an overview of what drones are and how they're used, and how that tool shapes us. And John is going to sort of explain how we got here in the first place. So I'm going to shuffle over there.
Obviously part of the reason we're talking now about these drones here today is because of the sort of 100th-year anniversary of the First World War. And one of the things that I found surprising when we did this research is how long the history of the drone is. I had thought, perhaps like most of you, that drones were a relatively new technology. And there are good reasons for that, because drones have expanded enormously in the last 10, 15, 20 years or so, for good reasons, both politically and technologically. But they do actually date right back to the First World War, in fact. There's a number of key technologies that get developed before the First World War that allow them to happen, I suppose. The first of these is the Serbian electrical genius Nikola Tesla, an immigrant to the United States, who demonstrated the first radio control of a boat, in this case, at Madison Square Gardens. It was kind of done as a magic trick, you know, he'd ask the audience to say, turn left, and the boat would magically turn left, and no one would know how it was done. But of course, this demonstrated this fundamental possibility of remote control. We should also remember that flight itself was very new in the First World War, at least powered heavier than air flight with a man on board. In 1903, this was the first such instance of such a flight, when the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk flew, I think, 120 yards in their Wright Flyer, which you can see is a fairly basic sort of aircraft. And that's only 11 years before the First World War begins. So it's a new thing, flight itself. There's another key bit of technology that gets developed at this time too. An American entrepreneur, inventor called Elmer Sperry He wasn't the first man to develop the gyroscope, but he was up there, and he was the first one to kind of make a working, commercially viable sort of device. I don't know if you're familiar with gyroscopes. I remember them from when I was a kid as kids' toys. You just kind of spin them, and they're difficult to knock off, of course. And the whole point of them is that they point in the same direction, and you can use that to generate stability. He first used these to make ships more stable. What they're able to do, basically, either through revolving a mast themselves or through activating electronic or electrical, I suppose we'd say in these days, controls, they can manage orientation in 3 dimensions, like pitch or yaw or roll. The gyroscope can stabilize those movements, which obviously in the case of an aeroplane, which you don't want to go, you'd rather just flew along steadily, is very important, especially if you're then going to take the man out of the aeroplane. So we've got radio control, we've got gyroscopic orientation of the plane. We can also point the plane with a gyroscope. We can use a gyroscope as a non-magnetic compass, which is a very useful thing when you're dealing with military technology, which is often made of iron and steel and tends to mess with ordinary compasses. You can use a gyroscopic compass. So there's that element as well. As I was saying, air power was a new thing, and at the start of the Great War, the nations that were in that conflict, they had aircraft, but they had few of them, and they were very, very primitive, not far removed from that Wright Flyer. We can see here the Germans had 245 planes, the French, who were probably the most advanced technologically in terms of aerospace at that time, only had 141. But you can also see that rather remarkable number, at least remarkable to me, in the next 4 years, the 4 years that the war lasted, those 3 combatants between them built 143,000 aircraft. So we go from almost 0 to this huge presence on the military field. They were, I suppose, dangerous. The casualties were enormous. 50,000 airmen were killed in the course of the Great War. Perhaps a fraction of the total, but a high proportion of the number of pilots involved. At one stage in the middle of the war, when German aircraft outclassed British aircraft for a while, British pilots' life expectancy was measured in days or weeks. So you can see there's a kind of a motivation there, at least, to get the pilot out of this very dangerous environment. And they experimented at this time with that technology. Here is one of those early drones, called the Curtis-Sperry aerial torpedo. The Sperry in that title is the same Sperry with the gyroscope. And this was an attempt to get this biplane to fly without a pilot. As you can see, it's a fairly significant aircraft, wouldn't have been cheap. The trouble with this aircraft was getting it to launch. The acceleration messes with the gyroscopic stabilizers, and if you read the accounts of the 12 launches of this aircraft that happened, they're almost comical because they all go the same way. Launched off the back of a car, swerved, crashed into the ground, destroyed. Launched off a catapult, swerved, crashed into the ground, destroyed. One of these, this way of launching it off a car was one of the more effective ways. One of the ways they lost one of these was because it lifted the car off the ground and then crashed. So, yeah, early days, ambitious, perhaps over-ambitious, given the technology. But on 6th of March 1918, a Curtis-Sperry catapulted cleanly into the air, flew its planned 1,000 yards, and then dived at its preset distance into the water off Long Island. It was recovered and reflown. That was probably the first controlled flight of an unmanned aerial vehicle. It was basically controlling itself, according to the preset parameters of those gyroscopic devices. There was also, in England at the time, another of these slightly oddball geniuses, a man called Archibald Lowe, who liked to be known as the Professor, though he wasn't one. He developed a radio-controlled aircraft, which they code-named the Aerial Target, in order to deceive the Germans. It was actually more like a flying bomb. I mean, strictly speaking, these have more in common with cruise missiles than they do with contemporary drones, because they weren't designed to come back. This thing flew, it flew under control for a little way and then crashed. The problem more apparently with the aircraft than with the radio control system, which did seem to work. You can see below it there's an aircraft called the Kettering Bugger, another American effort at this time, which I've called an early cruise missile. This had the same sort of gyroscopic controls. It had an interesting twist. It had a wind-driven turbine, which when it hit a preset number of revolutions, triggered a switch that caused the wings to fall off, and the thing would plummet onto its target and destroy it. The war came to an end before this technology really got into any usable form. So I think interestingly that we can see at the end of the Great War that we've had attempts at three key or critical technologies for UAVs. Automatic stabilization, remote control, and autonomous navigation. Also, we can see that air power has come along a good way, and the key roles have been established for the use of air by the military. And as historian John Buckley says, first and most crucial duty, reconnaissance and observation. That was then the key role of air power, and is today, though the glamour and interest attaches to the combat role, is the key role for unmanned aerial vehicles today too. But we can see from those four roles that drones today are operating in three of those roles. The only one they're not currently engaged in is air combat, but I expect that will come, probably not very far off. If we're also thinking about unlooked for change, maybe this introduction of air power had one kind of consequence that wasn't expected. I mean, what you've introduced is this highly mobile technology, but one of the effects, according to some thinkers about the First World War, was to bog things down into that trench warfare. It became very, very difficult to achieve strategic surprise. You couldn't move armies without your enemies knowing about it because of their aircraft, which is one of the main incentives for developing combat aircraft, to shoot down those reconnaissance planes so they wouldn't see what you were up to. Okay, we move past the Great War into the Between Wars period. And ironically, the sort of the main working drone of this period was an actual aerial target, as had been attempted to see the Germans with. This thing, the de Havilland Queen Bee, a development of it's kind of a combination of, I think it was a fox moth and a gypsy moth, maybe it was, the wings from one, the fuselage from another, but with radio control, with a working, effective radio control system that allowed this plane to be sold to the Royal Navy. They bought 420 of them, and it was used as a gunnery target for battleships, in which role it was very effective. And it's also demonstrated that it was very hard for battleships to shoot down aircraft, in fact, and they had quite a survival rate. We're into World War II. Another odd British guy involved here, Reginald Denny. He had been a pilot in the Royal Flying Corps, the precursor of the RAF at the beginning of the First World War. And he became a fan of radio-controlled aircraft, flying them as a hobbyist, essentially. Anyway, he was also a film actor, and he emigrated to the United States, to Los Angeles, became a very successful film actor, in fact. But he also maintained his interest in remote-controlled aircraft and set up a model store on Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles, where he sold something called the Denny Radioplane. And he developed this into something which he thought the US forces could use as a gunnery target. And with the advent of the Second World War, this became a reality, and he sold 15,000 of these Denny radioplanes. Now, he had a friend, another actor, a man called Ronald Reagan, who was at that time in charge of a US Army publicity unit operating out of Birdland Studios in Los Angeles. Anyway, he sent along a photographer to his friend Reginald Denny's radioplane factory one day to take some publicity shots. The photographer noticed a girl working on the line, thought she photographed well, spoke to her afterwards, arranged to take more photographs of her. And you can see this picture of her here. She was a woman called Norma Jean Doherty, later known as Marilyn Monroe. This was her big break. She was a worker on a drone factory line when she was discovered, which is, I guess, irrelevant to the future of drones, but kind of interesting. We also see in World War II, and this was something I didn't know, the first unmanned combat aerial vehicle. This thing, the Interstate TDR-1, a joint development of the US Navy and the Interstate factory. This added TV to the scheme. You could put a TV camera on the plane so you could see out of it. You could put another one so you could see its controls. And then someone flying in an accompanying aircraft could receive those images and control it. And a man called Delmer Farney in the US Navy rose to the rank of, at this time, the commander. He was involved in the development of radio-controlled aircraft for the US Navy from 1936. And there's a link back to the Queen Bee here, because the US Chief of Naval Operations saw the Queen Bee in operation and thought, yeah, I want one of those. And got Delmer Farney's to develop this thing, to set up a team and develop this system. And it actually was put into service. Farney took a fairly substantial organisation to the South Pacific with 50 of these aircraft and used them in combat against the Japanese Navy there. With some success. They were actually able to fly out, controlled but several miles away from another aircraft, Grumman Avengers in this case, and they were able to drop their weapons on the target and fly back to base. So this was in 19th of October 1944, one of these aircraft with a load of 300 and 100-pound bombs carried out the first successful drone strike. And that was where we were at the end of World War II. What became important after World War II, during the Cold War, was not combat drones, but surveillance. And the Americans were very keen to know what was going on in the Soviet Union and in China, particularly with regard to their nuclear programs. And for a while, through the development of this aircraft, you can see in this picture, Lockheed U-2, they pretty much had the freedom of the skies. It flew so high that they had no way of bringing it down. And up until 1960, the Americans could overfly the Soviet Union, photographing what they wanted, which was great for the Americans and very, very frustrating for the Soviet Union. And we come to 1916, this man, Gary Powers, and what is sometimes known as the Genesis event for UAV development. Gary Powers was a CIA operative, a pilot, flying these U-2s on these spying missions over Russia. And he was unlucky enough to be the pilot in the plane at the time when the Russians did figure out how to shoot them down. And they shot him down. He came down, he wasn't killed, he was captured, and as you can see here, he was put on trial in Moscow for espionage. He was found guilty and put in jail. He didn't spend very long, I think it was a couple of years, before he was swapped with a Soviet spy in the United States. But this incident changes everything in the United States. They can no longer overfly the Soviet Union without putting pilots in danger, without risking these great diplomatic incidents. And so the need to know remains, so they want to be able to do this without such a risk. And they start spending enormous amounts of money through various sort of dark agencies like the CIA, like the National Reconnaissance Office, like DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. Funding projects like this one, there are lots, I could go through lots of them, but I'll just tell you about this one. It's kind of the most extreme, the Lockheed D-21, codenamed Tagboard. What we're looking at here is actually a manned aircraft, the SR-71 Blackbird there, and on its back you can see this small delta-winged thing. That's the Tagboard, the unmanned element of this thing. In order for it to work, the manned aircraft, the fastest manned aircraft ever, has to ramp up to something like 3 times the speed of sound, which then allows the ramjet on this Tagboard to operate. It releases from the back and flies off, ideally, over China, to Loch Nor to photograph the nuclear facilities there and come back with its pictures. They launched 4 of these things and lost 4 of these things, and the 4th actually crashed into its mothership on launch and destroyed that. So it was a bit of a catastrophe, this one. There was, however, a working, rather more practical drone at this time. A workhorse of the Vietnam War, the Ryan Firebee, or Lightning Bug as later versions were known. This was a jet-powered, pretty much a true drone in as much as it was mostly flying automatically on a pre-programmed mission, not making any decisions itself, not being controlled from an accompanying aircraft, though it could be. You'd launch it from a C-130, as we see here, it's just been released, dropped off the bottom there, and it would fly fast and low over North Vietnam into dangerous territory and bring back usable imagery. And at this job, it was pretty successful. It did its job. It would photograph a swath approximately 1.5 to 3 miles wide, depending how high it was, for about 120 miles, fly back, where it would be caught in a net hung below a helicopter. It sounds a bit dodgy, but it actually worked. They had over 1,000 of these flying in Vietnam, and they flew over 3,000 missions. And during those 3,000 missions, 544 of them were lost, which I guess is pretty good odds, maybe 1 in 6. 2/3 of those were shot down, the other third were lost due to malfunction. I'll just show you. This is kind of interesting. I'm showing you because I think it's cool, basically. Declassified USAF report on the Lightning Bug operation, codenamed Buffalo Hunter. It was very secret. People didn't know at the time this was out. This report, you can see top left, was released for public use in 2006. So you can read all about this if you're interested. It's available online. The author, an Air Force major called Major Elder, he quotes Air Force General Voigt on Buffalo Hunter. This was in late 1973, after a bombing operation known as Linebacker 2. He said, "I know of no other way that we could have obtained the information we needed during the intensive combat activity of the December period." So there was no other way to do this than the drone, according to this general. And Elder sums up, the drone had flown hundreds of missions over hostile areas and had never lost a crew member. So we've got kind of those two key elements. It can go where other things can't, and even though it's dangerous, nobody gets killed. All right, I guess there are two main powers in the UAV world currently. Lots of other people are building them, but at the moment the Americans and the Israelis are in the lead. And there's been a close interchange at various times between those industries. For example, the origins of the Israeli industry are in the Ryan Firebee, of which they bought a few. When the Israelis were under terrible military pressure in the early 1970s, they used drones to extend the power of their Air Force. They used them for things like to fly them as enemy air defenses, which causes them to then switch on their radars, which allows your strike aircraft then to destroy those radars, or indeed to actually activate the systems themselves, and your enemy wastes his expensive anti-aircraft missiles shooting down your small, cheap UAVs. So those are a couple of the things that they did. This led to them developing their own industry. There's two main companies involved in Israel today, Elbit Systems and Israeli Aircraft Industries, that produce a range of highly effective UAVs. And among other countries, Canada acquired Israeli Herons for use in Afghanistan. They leased them. I think they've been given back now. But that's one of the Canadian Herons. Now, that Israeli experience and their success leads the Americans again to see that. And they actually see it when Israeli drones help with American gunnery, battleship gunnery targeting in events in the Lebanon in the 1970s. And as a result, the US Navy buys the Israeli drone Pioneer. That's the one that the guy is towing across there. You can see it's got American colours on it. Also, a man called Abe Karam, who had worked in the Israeli drone industry, a highly regarded aircraft designer, he moved to the United States and developed his own drone. You think about the expense and the ineffectiveness of all those attempts under those intelligence funded projects. He basically built a drone in a garage in Southern California, about the same time that Steve Jobs is forming Apple in a garage in another part of California. And the reasons are closely related. You know, the level of efficacy of microprocessors has got to a level where these things become much, much more simple, much more effective. And that's a thing called the NAT, which he built, and which the CIA bought for service when they needed it in the Yugoslav wars of the early 90s, which it worked fairly well at. It was a bit limited, it had to pass its data back to an accompanying aircraft, but it was a pretty good machine. He sold that company and went to work himself to a company called General Atomics, and they developed this NAT into what we now know as this kind of this first effective combat drone, the Predator. And I think I'll just tell you a little bit about the story of the Predator, because it's kind of interesting, I think. 1994, US military acquired it from General Atomics for the first time. It added cloud-piercing radar, global positioning systems, commercial satellite links. This allows both the control of the aircraft and the dissemination of the data it's acquiring to be fully independent of other aircraft. So it can fly, as Anne was describing, thousands of kilometers away and send its data back to them. The Kosovo War comes along. Anne and I were actually living just on the Kosovo border at the time. We remember it well. And a stealth fighter, the F-117, was lost in Serbia. There was a film about this, actually. I can't remember what it was called. But there was a lot of effort put into recovering that pilot. And again, that Gary Powers syndrome comes into play. And they think, well, you know, we should be using unmanned aircraft for this purpose. So in goes the Predator to this war. Unfortunately, the data from the Predator was not available to the accompanying strike aircraft. So it could pass its data back to Nevada, but the Nevada controllers then had to verbally cue the strike aircraft onto its target, which is obviously inefficient. Now, Air Force General John Jumper had the bright idea of attaching a laser designator pod to the Predator. They just took one off a helicopter and bolted it onto the Predator. The technology of drones is not unique to drones, it's the same technology, it's the unmannedness that really makes it different. So he straps this thing on, it can then illuminate the target and the strike aircraft can then release their laser-guided weapons without ever having to communicate with Nevada. So that was, you know, a useful step from the military's point of view. Now, as Jumper says himself now, the next logical step was to arm the Predator. Yeah? Why bother with the accompanying strike aircraft? It's got the designator, give it the weapon. And at the same time, the military were under pressure from the Clinton White House to kill or capture a man we would later become very familiar with, Osama bin Laden, following the 1998 embassy bombings in Tanzania and Kenya. And there was an operation called Afghan Eyes based in Uzbekistan, which actually flew and recovered the aircraft, though they were controlled from Nevada. The CIA were running this mission over Afghanistan, a country at that time with which America was not at war with, and they spotted bin Laden a couple of times, but had no tools for doing anything about it, which frustrated them. So that's how then they get the armed Predator going. They strap a Hellfire missile onto the underside of the thing. CIA Director George Tenet told the 9/11 Commission that arming UAVs would give them the ability to accurately and promptly respond to future sightings of high-value targets. On February 2001, the first live firing of a Hellfire missile from a Predator took place. Later that same year, the events of September the 11th happened, when the Twin Towers, etc., come down. 3 days later, 3 armed Predators are flying over Afghanistan from Uzbekistan. So I think you can see what's interesting there. From the start, this technology was associated with the pursuit of an individual, the same individual, in fact, that they were in pursuit of for a number of years. And it's a very different way of operating. You know, you're delivering a very expensive munition after one man, right? So he'd better be a high-value target. It's kind of like dropping a Porsche on his head. in terms of finance. All right, I'm pretty much there. I'm just going, because I just want you to have a complete picture. At the other end of the equation, there are very large UAVs out there, like this Northrop Grumman Global Hawk, 32-hour endurance. They can survey 100,000 kilometers a day. Very expensive, $200 million per copy, possibly even too expensive. Some later versions have been cancelled, but it does work, it does its job. At the other end of the scale is perhaps where, in a way, our eyes are caught by the outline, the familiar outline of the Predator and so on. But maybe what's most interesting, or will prove to be eventually, is the other end of the scale, where they're getting smaller and smaller, and where they've delivered local control, local aerial targeting or aerial surveillance for small squads of soldiers. Like the Aeroenvironment Raven, the best-selling drone in the world. 19,000 of these have been sold. Fly for about an hour, line of sight control, and with a decent high visibility camera that can look down, look around corners, etc. And so soldiers who won't walk into an ambush, perhaps, would be the simplest way of putting it. The other picture is a British soldier in Afghanistan flying something called the Prox Black Hornet, a Norwegian device, a little helicopter, I don't know if you can see it there, that will fly for about half an hour, fairly high-tech, deliver high-res imagery. If it loses control, it can fly back to base, that sort of thing. About $100,000 for two of those and its little book-sized controller. So I guess that's where we are now. They may get even smaller, and there is a man who classifies these things in terms of: 1, can I see it and recognize it in flight? 2, can I recognize it across a room? 3, can I recognize it when it's in my hand? And 4, still science fiction at the moment, do I need a forensics team to know it's there? And we may well get to that point. Who knows? That's one aspect of the future. One way the future is going that we can see now in drones that are being experimented with is something like this Northrop Grumman X-478. Faster, stealthier, and more autonomous would basically be its advantages. Okay, I think I'm going to hand back to Anne now to just sort of finish up talking about how drones have been used.
Okay, so I just want to start putting this together, again, going back to some of the large-scale changes that these systems may introduce to us. And as you've heard from John's account there, I mean, basically these things were developed in order to save the lives of pilots and the lives of military crew. So it wasn't about us, it was about them. But I'm interested in whether they are going to benefit us as civilians. And so I've got some casualty stats up there that show you that during World War I, it was actually pretty safe to be a civilian. Only 15% of the people that were killed in that conflict were civilians. And you see how that number starts to change. So since World War II, now it is far safer to be in uniform than it is to be out of uniform. You're actually better off being in the military during war if you want to live. So there's a whole bunch of reasons for that, but I'm just interested in what drones add to this picture. This is a good example of what drones should be able to do. And this is a still from some footage that the Israeli Defense Forces shot during the recent action in Gaza. You know, they can see very clearly, or to some extent, they can kind of identify who their targets are and who they want to try to avoid shooting, which is the civilians, of course. And this piece was broadcast because it actually shows them calling off an attack because civilians would have been harmed. So drones seem to reduce risk to human life in really useful ways. And so although the impetus was to save the lives of soldiers, the side effect, this very positive side effect, is that they should be able to reduce collateral damage. But perversely, what we're seeing is that instead of saving civilian lives, we're seeing a lot of civilians being killed anyway, both in war zones and outside of war zones. And so is there something about drones that make this more likely? Is this really bad news for civilians? And if it is this really the kind of technology our military should be like going, be so enthusiastically embracing? So I'm just going to give you a very brief overview of how they're being used, and then you can think about that. So we'll start off looking at war zones. And you're also going to see there's a lot of gaps in the research again. It's really hard to figure out what's going on. So drones mainly, as John described, have been used by the US and its allies in war zones of Afghanistan and Iraq, but we know most about Afghanistan. Afghanistan is the world's most drone-attacked country. And as John said, it started in September 2001, right off the bat. And just to give you a sense of that, between January 2008 and October 2011, there were over 1,000 drone strikes in Afghanistan. And this was about the same time that Obama had his surge in Afghanistan, with sending a lot of extra US soldiers on the ground as well. So this is just part of an overall military operation. But 1,000 strikes. So they're doing a lot of surveillance, but they're also doing a lot of attacking. Now, the unfortunate thing is we know very little about drone warfare in Afghanistan and how they're conducting it. The International Security Assistance Force, they used to publish some statistics about their drone strikes in the drone program, but then they stopped. They said the statistics were being misused and misunderstood. And furthermore, they then went back into their website and they took down all the stuff they had published. So, but what we know from when we saw that stuff is that, and this is what they said, that about 97% of the missions were surveillance missions, and about 3% of those missions were attack events, or what they called kinetic events. And the ISAF's position was, well, they're used so seldom for attack that who cares, we're not going to bother giving you those numbers. But 1,000 strikes, so they are big numbers. Now there's another problem, because the US military is also very secretive. They don't keep separate figures on who's been killed by a drone versus who's been killed in a more conventional kind of attack. They say, if you're killed by a Hellfire missile, it doesn't really matter who shot it at you. So they don't break out those numbers, so you can't see what the proportions are. The US government claims that they don't count civilian casualties. Although we know from the WikiLeaks intercepts that they do keep track of casualties, they just don't. They just say they don't. And it's also really hard to get the American administration to admit that civilians are ever killed. As far as they're concerned, they only ever kill the bad guys. And in fact, the Obama administration infamously defined legitimate targets in areas as, this is a quote, all military-aged males in a strike zone. So, anybody here of military age, any of you guys, you're obviously a militant and obviously a target if the Americans decide there's a problem here. So as far as the war zones go, it's hard to figure out what they're actually doing. It doesn't look too good. We do know that they are, the civilians do get killed because we get that kind of verification from other sources, the UN, for example. Now we'll have a look at the non-war zones. And we actually know more about these so-called secret wars of Obama's in Pakistan, also in Yemen and Somalia, but mainly in Pakistan. And this is because researchers and NGOs and journalists have done worked really hard to try and collate that information and get it out and get it verified. So even here it's quite sketchy, and you can see from the figures there, that there's a broad kind of parameters, with 2,300 or 3,800 people killed. They don't really know. They're just trying to. The numbers haven't been nailed down yet. But so just remember that these are countries that the U.S. is not at war with. These are just peaceful countries going about their business. Now, so what's interesting here, if you look at Pakistan, there's about 500 attacks here, all told. Now, there's no way the U.S. would have sent in 500 manned missions. They would not have sent in, 500 special forces missions or manned aircraft missions into these zones when they're not at war with these countries. It would just be way, way too risky. And so in that sense, drones have enabled the US to take military action it would not otherwise have attempted because those risks would have been far too high. Pakistan, it just had its 400th strike a few days ago. They're having a really bad month this month. I suppose we're all supposed to be looking at ISIS and not looking at Pakistan. So the Americans have really ramped up strikes there. There have been 8 drone strikes this month, between 25 and 42 people killed. This is a report that came out about 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon, so I didn't get very far through it. I was trying to pull it out for you guys so you can see it. And this gives us an idea about who is being killed and also why it's really, really important to have those casualty figures. And from what this group in the UK have managed to dig up, so the Naming the Dead project is what it's called, they're just trying to identify those people that are killed in drone strikes in Pakistan and figure out who they are, and then we can see whether they're civilians or militants or whatever. They've been able to identify about 2,400 of them, and you can see there that it looks like less than half of those people belong to militant groups. So we're looking at about more than half of people being killed in these drone strikes are civilians. And this kind of is where the issue of time and persistence comes into play. And so I just want to draw attention to that, because you remember that drones give us that persistence, and they also are very accurate. So what we see is these very small attacks. Often you just see pages and pages of this kind of data that these NGOs are collating. 2 people killed, 3 people killed, 5 people killed, 1 person killed, every few days. And so nothing ever, it just kind of bubbles along, and it doesn't ever really get over the, grab our attention. So we get these very small numbers of people being killed over a very long period. But in essence, these countries have been being attacked regularly for 10 years now, and with very little blowback from us. Public opinion is generally very supportive of these kinds of actions, because we're told that these are only the bad guys that are being killed, and that makes the world safer. So that's what's been sort of going on. But the numbers obviously add up. We've had hundreds of drone strikes and thousands of people killed. And now for my final example, I'm just going to have a look at Gaza, which is another kind of operation entirely, because what we see here is a kind of mature drone warfare form. And just to give you a little bit of background, so this is what I'm working on now, and this is the Operation Protective Edge that took place in July and August, when the Israelis launched an operation against Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Now in that conflict, over 2,100 Palestinians were killed in 50 days. So this was a very short, very intense war. Now, these people were not necessarily killed by drone strikes, but drones in this war were fully integrated into the other operations. So they were working with artillery and aircraft and ground troops. And you can see these infographics I'm using. They're produced by the Israeli Defense Forces to kind of tell the story from their side. And you can see how they're telling this story. They're saying, the Israelis protect their civilians and then send their weapons across into Gaza, and the Hamas uses the civilian population as human shields. So that's the way they justify their actions. Now, drones, that they help us better understand the fight that militaries are in. Israel says it uses the most sophisticated weapons available, that the drones were the absolute backbone of its operation. And they took extraordinary efforts to avoid killing and wounding civilians. And yet, even so, even with all that care, more than half the people they killed were civilians. And those are the Israeli figures. The UN puts the figures at around 70%. So in other words, using the best, most accurate weapons available during a very limited military operation, under very ideal circumstances for a military, because they have superiority there. Civilians were being killed at around the same rate as they were being killed during World War II, which was, of course, a long war with POW camps and concentration camps, and firebombing of cities, the use of the atomic bomb in Japan. So how can this be? How can we still be having the same rate of civilian casualties? I think it may be because how drones do work over time, how they extend war across time. The Israelis were conducting surveillance operations over Gaza since 2005. This last Operation Protective Edge is just the most recent one, but they do have these occasional military operations. But that surveillance goes on all the time. So they're just gathering intelligence and they're looking for targets. And by the time an actual military operation started, this is what Gaza looked like to the Israeli Defense Forces. And so, again, this is a map produced by the IDF of a Gaza neighborhood. And you can see it's a very heavily built up urban neighborhood. You can see that Hamas is embedded in that population, so the civilians become de facto human shields. And you can also see that the Israelis have called a lot of targets into being. They have identified a lot of things that they need to attack, they say. And so during those 50 days, they actually attacked 4,762 targets, and they've been collecting those targets for years. So they've been collecting those targets, and then when the gloves came off, when the operation started, they just went in and started attacking. Now, so even though we know that Israel spends a lot of time and care on selecting their targets, they know where the hospitals are, they know where the kindergartens are, they know where the schools are. They constantly update that information because they have that ongoing surveillance. They weigh the risk of killing civilians versus neutralizing the targets they're after. And they have lawyers advising them, and not just lawyers, but they also have a military ethicist inside the IDF that also helps them deal with the ethical issues of their targeting. And so you can't say that the civilian casualty level is because of carelessness or that it's indiscriminate. In fact, it's very discriminating. But I think what you see here is the effects of when you start aggregating all those small attacks. If you're just taking out one or two people or a small target with a small munition, if you do that 4,762 times, you're going to cause a lot of damage. And in this case, if you're doing it in a civilian environment, you're going to kill a lot of civilians. So it seems that drones are good at saving military lives, but they're making civilian lives much more expendable because they seem to make them easy targets to hit that need to be hit. So John is just going to sum up there, and then I think we'll have even a few minutes for questions. If you pass.
So yeah, I'm literally just going to sum up. What difference do drones make? That's our research question, and we think there's a complex of differences. Firstly, they lower the threshold for using military force because the stakes for the user are lower. This absence of risk to personnel and lowered levels of potential political and diplomatic embarrassment allows the extension of military activity into areas where there is no conventional conflict. Their persistence in time and consequent availability in space makes them present increasingly everywhere and everywhen, if I can coin a word. They can therefore extend surveillance and attack over long periods of time, and their persistent aerial gaze can call many, many targets into being. Through their effective surveillance and their accurate weapons, they allow the application of military force against individuals, what we have termed nano-war. It seems acceptable because few people are being killed along with the otherwise inaccessible target. But you add it together a lot of nano-war events because you can, over time, and you have significant loss of life with a significant civilian component. Nano-war maybe isn't so nano after all, perhaps. Proportionally, civilian deaths are occurring at much the same rate as in wars with carpet bombing. Okay, that's us. Thank you.